How appropriate is that? Are there other ways to do it, etc.? Okay, so the big picture with respect to the agency-wide programmatic agreement is that it is a management approach. So yes, it's full of different types of things than what we're used to seeing. But it meets the intent of Section 106 and responds to NASA's unique assets, mission requirements, and management constraints. So the tools and the approaches that you see in the APA are attempting to do that, to carry out NASA's responsibilities under Section 106, but also to acknowledge that NASA's resources are limited. And as a result, NASA would like to try to focus their resources on its properties that are the most significant. And as you all know, they have some pretty significant properties. So all U.S. property that NASA owns falls into two categories under the APA: HTSF districts and heritage zones. So HTSF districts are synonymous with the centers themselves. Heritage zones are areas within the larger HTSF district that we are identifying as worthy of a more robust consultation because of their unique characteristics. So what we're trying to achieve with these two constructs, the HTSF district and the heritage zones, is expedited consultation in certain areas, but then robust consultation in those areas where there's the greatest sensitivity. So all that you see in the APA is kind of advancing these concepts. So HTSF districts, as we define it in the APA, they're the centers, gate to gate, all NASA property. That actually, I should say, rolls up to the centers that are participating in the programmatic agreement. So just to refresh your memory on that, centers that have existing center-wide programmatic agreements in place that govern the entire center will not be operating under the APA. So it would only be those centers that do not have a comprehensive center-wide programmatic agreement, including Johnson, which has a space shuttle specific programmatic agreement, but not a gate-to-gate center comprehensive programmatic agreement. So HTSF districts are synonymous with NASA centers. They are defined by the collection of highly technical or scientific facilities that populate them and around which they have been built and that are the purpose of their existence in the first place. Because of that nature and that purpose and origin, the centers have a very different look to them. It's a very functional priority with aesthetics secondary. That is not to say that there isn't an aesthetic of functionality, because of course there is, but it's not quite the same thing as going into a residential historic district, where aesthetic plays a significant role in how that district is articulated and defined. HTSF districts are always changing. And the analogy that we kind of think of is, you have an HTSF, you recognize that by definition, in order for that HTSF to be, to remain relevant, you have to modify it, you have to upgrade it, you have to make the changes that allow it to continue to be used at that cutting edge of technology. Similarly, that's how we're viewing the HTSF districts. The same level of modification and change and flexibility really should be available to NASA in managing its assets at its centers, specifically because of this HTSF quality. Now, that is not to say that there aren't special places, and forgive me for my touchy-feely language here, but there are places at the NASA centers where when you're standing, you have a sense of hierarchy, formality, express design aesthetic. You feel that you're at the core of that center. Usually that's, the original cluster of buildings, or it might be around the primary administrative building, or it might be a pre-existing historic district, as is the case at Ames with Shenandoah Plaza. They are distinguishable, and they are, because of their qualities and that feeling that you get when you're experiencing this zone, which we're calling a heritage zone, they merit some additional consideration. And NASA recognizes that a level of consideration above and beyond elsewhere at the center is appropriate in these areas. And so we're calling those heritage zones. Again, this is a management tool. So it's not the same thing as a National Register Historic District. It's actually, as we've envisioned it, much more tightly defined. And I'm going to show some examples of sort of the concept on Google Earth and kind of show you guys some of what we're thinking about. So just a reminder before I do that, that the APA, as the way things currently stand, would apply to the centers on the left and not the centers on the right, which have their own center-wide agreement document in place. Actually going to stick with that. All right, so I do love to pick on Ames, but I'm using, to illustrate the concept, I'm using 3 centers that we visited over the last year as part of the RSF study and ground truthing of the RSF. And we had the opportunity to chat with the CRM on site and sort of think through these concepts. And so that's Goddard, Ames, and Johnson are going to be the 3 that I'm using to illustrate the concept. So here we are at Ames. So this is just a very rough Carrie sketched, and so it's not going to be precise kind of outline of the boundary of Ames, the primary center of Ames. What I would propose for consideration is as a heritage zone, that is to say, this zone that is special, that requires a higher level of consideration when changes are being made to it. I would offer this area here, the sort of administrative core, the pre-NASA cluster of buildings here, which I know, I don't know if Trina's joined us today or if California's joined us today, but this area is specifically under consideration under a traditional historic district concept, which would likely pull in quite a bit more than this. And that's why we're not just using the concept of a historic district here, because the purpose of a historic district is to pull in as much as possible, right? You have to justify exclusion based upon history and visual characteristics. So the heritage zone is sort of like a protected zone. It's, in this case, as a concept, it's really just the area that is required to preserve this special kind of circular core of Ames. So that is kind of what we would be thinking about as a heritage zone. Now, a little bit different, but we talked about Shenandoah Plaza. So we know that Shenandoah Plaza is an identified historic district, the boundaries of which were expanded in 2013 to include the runways and hangars on the other side. That's a huge area. Under the heritage zone concept, we would propose an area something more like this. So this is your very traditionally defined campus with, that very military style hierarchy of buildings. When you're standing here, you do very much feel that aesthetic, and it's a special experience. And we certainly acknowledge that, and acknowledge that it is something that should be protected. So in this particular case, what the APA proposes is that these two areas are managed as heritage zones, and as such, they have a higher level of consultation and project review. And the rest is managed as an HTSF district. So the HTSF district has greater flexibility. The only sort of project specific, the project specific reviews are more limited. And I'll pull up the consultation matrix in a moment so we can refresh our memories on that. Let me just kind of stick with this and open it up to comments, questions. What is of concern to you all? What are you uncomfortable with? Is there another way to achieve NASA's goals and its program, which is, to spend the time and the money and the resources on the most important assets consistent with its responsibilities, but get greater flexibility outside of that? So this is just one way to do it. And this is what we are proposing in our current draft. Now, keep in mind, hopefully, I'm sure you've all read every word of the APA, that notwithstanding this construct, there is still separate consideration for ground disturbance and separate consideration for individually eligible assets. So if you have an individually eligible asset outside of a heritage zone, it still requires a project-specific consultation in the event of demolition specifically. Let's see, Chris, I think I saw a question just popped up here.
Yeah, hi everybody, Chris Daniel from the ACHP. So I was just curious how the heritage zone relates to any existing identification efforts, i.e. particularly a historic district. Are they synonymous, or are they a subset within a historic district? And I know not all NASA facilities have districts identified, but
right,
in keeping with the existing nomenclature that we have, I'm trying to, I want to see the reasoning behind having a different term, and if, how that kind of augments or enhances the situation, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Sure. So, this is where I give the official warning to Rebecca that I might go a little rogue, and she can smack me down if I'm going off the rails here. So NASA's approach to historic districts, and this is not atypical of federal agencies, has been very conservative, because there is a perception that historic districts are difficult to manage, that the higher level of Section 106 scrutiny makes them undesirable. Not that they don't exist, but that, it's like a don't ask, don't tell kind of thing. So NASA centers have approached the identification of historic districts inconsistently. It's changed a little bit over time, under different staff people and different leadership. It changes based upon who SHPO reviewers are and what their interests are. But the primary idea is that, yeah, okay, we're going to acknowledge that there's a cluster of related buildings here that are a historic district, but we don't want to make it too big. So when you do have a historic district that's identified, it might start small with a limited period of significance, and then maybe every 5 years or 10 years, it's reevaluated. Should it be bigger? Should the period of significance be expanded? And what it ends up being is a lot of kind of overlapping or concurrent but discontiguous considerations, if you will, from a management perspective. And you end up with a situation where you can never be really confident that a project is or is not in a historic district, because not only do you need to think about the ones that have formally been identified, but you have to think about the ones that haven't been formally identified. And so, and this is partly me because I'm an architectural historian and I'm always thinking about all those directions that something can be historically significant. So years ago, when we started this process, we kind of thought, okay, well, how big should the district be? Should you have, separate districts, Shenandoah Plaza, and then no historic district adjacent to it? Or do you really have a district that includes most of these assets, maybe all of these assets? And at what point are you really just talking about the center itself? So I want to clarify that under the APA, this is the HTSF districts are intended to be, again, a management tool, not a formal determination of eligibility. But what it is intended to do in part is remove that kind of parsing out of different sections of NASA centers into different, but often interrelated, both physically and thematically, mini districts, because of the perception that that's how you keep from being overburdened by Section 106. So in cases where you have, we all know that the purpose of reviewing and considering historic districts through Section 106 is to, in fact, preserve that unique character. Certainly, we're not arguing that is not the case. But what we would argue is that because of the HTSF quality, because these are centers comprised of HTSF, which look different, look utilitarian, look really strange, they're very functionally based. It's not the same thing as your traditional historic district and shouldn't be managed in the same way. However, I was not comfortable, and from the very beginning, of just saying, okay, the whole thing's a district and we're just going to manage it as one entity, because you do have these special zones, these places that are have a heightened design character, and that does merit consideration. But these areas would be smaller than a National Register Historic District would be, and is in the case of Shenandoah Plaza. So as a management construct, they make more sense than the historic district, the multiple historic districts at NASA centers. Rebecca, do you want to add to that? Did I express that okay?
Yeah, I think you expressed that well. I think You know, I'm not an architectural historian, and so in the, the 7.5 years I have been at NASA, I've really struggled with the way that we have approached historic districts. And Chris, Daniel, you and I have talked about this a lot. It hasn't made a lot of sense to me. And so this, I think, is a more logical way of thinking about what the NASA centers really are in terms of a cultural resource or a collection of cultural resources, and how we can best focus our attentions when we think about how to manage them.
Yeah, and I can jump in. I mean, I know that we aren't necessarily considering Kennedy in this, but I'm, Kennedy Space Center, we have a few historic districts, but I wouldn't call it a historic district in a traditional sense. They happen to draw a line around clusters of buildings that technologically function together, right? There was a something similar happening in these three buildings. And so they drew a line around it. But they're all still highly technical scientific facilities. So they're built in the 70s. They have no aesthetic to them. And they're constantly being tweaked or updated, right, from the highly technical scientific thing. So from at least Kennedy's perspective, it's not a historic district in a traditional sense. It's just a cluster of HTSF that were lumped together because they all supported a function within the space shuttle program or, one of the other programs that we had here.
Thank you, Rebecca and Catherine. I think that helps to illustrate. Okay, so Beth has a question. So what about the NASA historic districts that have already been identified and determined eligible? Does that no longer matter for the management and treatment purposes under the APA? Under the APA, that distinction no longer matters, is the short answer. And since you brought up Goddard, let's fly to Goddard. They no longer matter within the framework of management, I should say. All right, so again, Goddard is a big sprawling, a many splendored sprawling thing. But what I've done is just outline this sort of primary cluster of buildings here, the primary physical plant. What I might propose as a heritage zone at Goddard is this area here. So your DOE'd historic district, I'm not exactly sure what the boundaries of it are, but I think it includes most, if not all of these. But what this proposed conceptual heritage zone does is pulls in your original primary building cluster, your primary functional areas when the center was first laid out. And although these are a little bit less visually connected than maybe some of the other centers, there's certainly a discernible design aesthetic, as has been pointed out by our Christopher Goodwin in their studies, that merits consideration here. Beth, what do you think about that? Just again, as a concept.
Okay, I'm just unmuting. Well, I still kind of have to digest this. I guess I'm having a hard time understanding the concept since we traditionally deal with historic properties for 106 and where we have these districts that, we've agreed are eligible and now we're not going to be treating them as eligible except for a subset. I mean, I understand the goal. I understand NASA's constraints. But I'm just having a hard time with the concept of saying this is a historic property, but it's not really under the APA. We're only going to care about this one particular area. And then that begs the question, well, how does NASA want these historic districts to be treated when there's external undertakings that may be impacting them, and we've had a number of transportation projects around Goddard where, you know, Goddard's been treated as a historic property because that's the way it shows up in our records. So, you know, are you going to want us to wipe that out of our records?
Rebecca, would you like me to respond to that before you weigh in, or would you like to weigh in now?
No, go ahead.
So since the APA would only apply to NASA, what Section 106 considerations for other agencies, such as, you know, DOTs, would be a different thing. They would not operate under the APA. So in that context, the federal agency, I guess, would have a choice whether or not they want to utilize this construct that NASA is operating under, or they just want to stick with the traditional identification of historic districts. Because I guess the way I would kind of present the HTSF/heritage zone concept is that NASA is asking for flexibility, more flexibility than they might normally get in some areas, but offering more focused attention to the preservation of other areas. Again, notwithstanding ground disturbance and individually eligible properties. But what this does for NASA is it makes things simpler and clearer. You know, when do I have a zone I've got to worry about consulting with the SHPO about or not? You know, have all the historic districts been identified or not? Has this asset been evaluated as an individual asset and as a contributing asset or not? All of these questions can be answered differently at different centers. So I do understand, and the CRMs share, Beth, your concern about, do historic districts go away? Well, no, they don't go away. They're still there. It's just that they're being managed in a particular way. And so the identification that NASA undertakes would de-emphasize districts and emphasize individual eligibility.
Yeah,
all right, Rebecca and sorry, go ahead, Beth.
That's helpful. And maybe, and I assume, I'm sorry I didn't get to look at the topics for our biweekly meeting. So I assume one of our other topics will be the gate-to-gate surveys.
Yes.
So that I guess some of these issues will be resolved during that, because yeah, the evaluation certainly at Goddard was done a long time ago and many resources were definitely not looked at individually. So I guess within the context of that, that's the opportunity for NASA and SHPOs to reach agreement on what are the individually eligible resources.
Yes. So Rebecca, you've got your hand up and so does Chris. I'll let you guys fight it out.
So I just wanted to add, notwithstanding everything Carrie just said, that to my mind, it's a little bit more nuanced than we're just going to ignore existing historic districts. So Goddard is a really good example, because that main campus of Goddard is a identified historic district. And one of the things that we are proposing to do is to, by treating each center as a gate-to-gate HTSF district, we have this programmatic mitigation that we are going to do upfront for every center that falls under the APA, which the goal is to capture each center as a distinct district, right? And so that we are sort of accounting for that discrete cultural resource that is the center, and we can capture the changes to the center over time. So to my mind, that is kind of how we are sort of not pivoting, evolving the concept of the historic district and broadening it into a gate-to-gate unit.
Thank you, Rebecca. And in my attempt to kind of try not to get too out of the swim lane for this topic, you have appropriately brought in the fact that, you know, the APA proposes programmatic mitigation, which addresses the HTSF district. And the APA proposes standard treatment measures, specific mitigation for individually eligible assets. Chris.
So I think some of the explanation was actually doing more harm than good, because I think what you're really getting at is that under this PA, NASA these facilities want to consult on the establishment of a particular zone that will tailor how 106 reviews are conducted, and that the concept of identified historic district isn't going away. Like, those tools are codified in the Park Service regulations. So those are the ways we have to identify historic properties, or property, you know, site, building, object, district, you know, what have you, and structure. So those tools don't go away, but the PA is taking that information that exists and saying, well, how are we going to manage 106 within this center? And from what I read in the current PA, because obviously these zones aren't yet established in the PA, at least not in there's no, the appendices just blank, that the center or NASA overall is going to have to consult with a SHPO and other parties to establish said zone. Is that, I'm seeing you nod your head there, Carrie. So
yes,
that zone
that is the intent. Yes,
would be informed off of all the existing identification efforts that have taken place at the NASA facility, I would imagine. So you would have a subset of information go, okay, well, what comprises our heritage zone? And you say even in there that it could be identical to a district, or it could be within a identified district. And so if there are guidelines that exist for a district, then you could already adhere to those guidelines for the heritage zone. But I think, and you can't see me because I'm in the office and I don't have a working webcam, but I'm kind of holding hands and saying that up in the air, saying that these two concepts don't cancel each other out, but run more parallel. There is the identification requirements under Section 106 and under the larger Park Service regulations for identifying historic properties. But what NASA's trying to do is, okay, so we have historic properties. We have a tool that's going to help us identify them. Now, when we conduct reviews for activities that have the potential to affect historic properties, what are the different levels of treatment and consideration that you're going to do? And this heritage zone is a higher level of consideration that has to take place, is the way I'm understanding it, compared to other areas where there will be more flexibility that NASA is seeking for types of activities. And so I think I think what I understand from looking at the draft and what you've said, that's what I'm seeing that as. And if that's the case, I think that's perfectly approachable, because that's merely tailoring your approach to 106. And just relying on existing information to shape these zones. But I think I would want to, I think I would need more detail when looking at the PA as to how those zones are developed, so that the individual states, they're the ones who are going to have a lot of interest in them, how they get the input to provide to that research center as how it's developed. So that's my 10 cents on it.
Yes, and I'd like to add to that, if I may, Chris, that I don't want to oversimplify it, but I do think in terms of, mutual benefit, what are the SHPOs and consulting parties getting, and what is NASA getting? Somewhere in the middle is where we hope to be over the next few months. So in the absence of a management approach, AKA a programmatic agreement, there's a lot of uncertainty, lack of clarity, confusion, inconsistency about the concepts that we all understand: districts, individual eligibility, et cetera, whether or not a project has the potential to affect historic properties, et cetera. And so what Rebecca has come to this task with is the idea that, we want to bring consistency to the approach at different centers. We want to be in compliance. So instead of, this lack of definition, which is hard on SHPOs, it's hard on CRMs, it's hard on NASA, it's hard for NASA to plan and look forward and understand what it needs to be accounting for. It's hard for consultants to know what they should be identifying on site and how. What this does is lays that management construct on top of NASA centers and simplifies all that. And, you know, there are some, like, you know, like I keep saying, there are some things that the consulting parties might give a little bit on, but there are also some things that NASA's going to give a little bit on. And the way we envision the heritage zones, and the way we've written it in the APA, is that there's a different review procedure in a heritage zone, partly because we want to get that flexibility outside of the heritage zone, but also because we want to incentivize design guidelines for the centers. We want to encourage them to implement with their SHPOs design guidelines for these areas. And so the way we've got it written now is if you've got design guidelines for these areas and you're proposing something that's compatible with those design guidelines, you have a simpler process. So in that way, we're hoping that you have more formalized protection and consideration of these districts than they're currently getting, outside of those that do have design guidelines. Like I know JPL's got a district with a design guideline. So let's fly to Johnson real quick. Take us 30 seconds, folks. Poor Johnson, Goddard, and Ames. I'm picking on them all the time. Okay. Again, this just Carrie's clumsy sketch. So Johnson, this is roughly the boundaries of Johnson Space Center. And do we have anyone from Texas or Johnson on today? Okay, then forgive me if I'm going to say I might get this wrong. But the way I understand it is that Johnson manages its center as a historic district in some ways and maybe not in others. They identify contributing buildings readily and generously, but the manner in which that may or may not affect decisions that are being made at the center and when the SHPO is engaged and not engaged is not well defined. So Johnson is a place where, yeah, you do have a shared design aesthetic, and intentionally so, of these prefabricated kind of concrete panels throughout the center that has that Johnson look that has been there since the beginning. You've got it, you know, out here along the edges as well as, you know, at the core. But what I would say is, are we really concerned about a concrete, you know, maintaining a concrete panel aesthetic out in these areas? Is that really necessary? Or are we trying to preserve that quintessential, you know, NASA experience that you get when you're in this area? So I would argue that this is really the design experience that has meaning in a traditional sense for Johnson. You know, when you're standing here, you're standing here, you're standing here, you get a strong sense of, you know, what you see in the movies. When you're talking about the space program, this merits special consideration. But should you really be too worried about what's going on outside of that? We would offer that greater flexibility outside of that area is appropriate. What do you guys think of this one? This is actually a bigger one. I tried to make it as small as I was comfortable with. And this area down here, for those of you that are familiar with it, is the engineering quad. It's not real sexy to look at as an aerial image, but you know, it's a pretty, you know, well-defined design aesthetic in here.
Hey, Carrie, this is Chris again. I can't, I'm not going to speak for the Texas SHPO folks, but I think, again, from our perspective, if a zone like this was something that the PA established a process for, and it was consulted on with the appropriate SHPO, you know, as part of the management process for this PA, as that this is the area where certain reviews are going to have to go and undergo a higher level of scrutiny, I don't have an issue with the PA establishing a process on it. I think in my mind, I just want to make sure we keep separate the idea that there's this existing body of work of identifying properties here, that all of that's going to be used to help inform this decision, and that, you know, those things are still valuable tools, but that the PA is setting, well, let's identify the area where 106 reviews have to get the highest level of attention, because if they aren't done with great consideration, they're going to diminish the integrity of these properties. Is that, I mean, that's me, does that seem, that seems reasonable in my mind, but I'm
Yes.
only one voice in many.
I think as a management construct, that's exactly what we're trying to do. We don't want to erase anything. We acknowledge that there's an existing body of identification. But I do want to clarify, and we'll talk about it and this is addressed in the APA in the identification section. As currently written, NASA would not be identifying new historic district boundaries or contributing properties for the purposes of management under the APA. Everything is contributing. Everything is considered contributing and will be mitigated through the programmatic mitigation, which documents the center as a unit. Individually eligible properties will continue to be identified. And so the focus of identification efforts will be on understanding on an individual level NASA's assets. And you know, I definitely won't pick on anybody here, but as an architectural historian, and maybe other people can relate to me here, you know, your client says, hey, I'm going to pay you X amount of money to go out and look at this entire, you know, however many acre facility, and, you know, tell me if there's a district there, but I don't want it to be too big. And, you know, I don't want to, you know, I'm not comfortable with a district having a period of significance into the 90s or the 80s. So as an architectural historian, we kind of tiptoe out there and we're like, all right, we think we can kind of sell this. This makes sense. I mean, it'd be great if it was objective, but it's not, for a variety of reasons. And so, in my opinion, NASA's giving more than they might normally be doing, because they're accepting that the center itself is something to be recorded and shared with the public, that the change to the center over time as a unit is an important story to tell. And in that way, you're de-emphasizing what might be like a you're taking a macro focus instead of a micro focus on, we're going to demolish this one small contributing asset, and we're going to document that contributing asset. Well, okay, but maybe there's a better way. There's something more valuable than just focusing on that individual contributing, kick out individual, that less important contributing asset.